With Grid Legends finally having its last DLC release, I thought it'd be time to review the game as a complete edition, because I bought the season pass and have spent many hours playing this game. This is definitely a game that has grown on me over the course of time, and especially because I think with my sheer disappointment of F1 2022, F1 Manager, and a few other racing games that have just really been subpar for me, I've come to appreciate Grid Legends much more post-release than I did when I first picked this game up. The first thing I wanted to say was just how huge the game is, and how expansive all of the different modes are as well. There is, I think about 70 odd different variations of tracks. Now obviously you've got Brands GP, Brands Indy, there's a couple of versions of Fuji, there's about 6 versions of Indy with the oval and the different road circuits. Their fictional ones have all different layouts in them as well. But they all feel different and interesting. Quite a lot of them can be driven in reverse as well, although not all of them. And there's also then stunt versions of them that have just been added in with the recent update in the last DLC. So there's previously there was about 20 different ramp versions of courses, and now there's over 50. Then they've put in boost versions of events as well, so that you can do more electronic racing around things. The game has well over 100 cars, and although they're split into various kind of categories, there's tons of sub-categories that are then underneath that you can then pick on to have various different types of multi-class racing, of either cars racing in the same class together, or you can have different classes all on the same track together, so some extra chaos that's going on, particularly if you want to muck about with the DLC that added on endurance racing, for example. So you've got electric cars, you've got GT, touring, open wheel, what they call specials, which are all kind of weird and wonderful cars being thrown in together, track day cars, and special variations of those that have been pimped up to the eyeballs, tuner cars, which are kind of American muscle type things, super trucks and trucks, and there was plenty of other ones thrown in there for good measure as well. Even the old Renault 2006, which Cody still has the license to, makes an appearance. In terms of tracks, there's absolutely tons of those too, with all of the different variations that we've just gone over before, but it also extends to the race types as well. So you've got the general racing and time trial, which you'd expect. You've got multi-class racing, which you can pick and choose and have up to 6 different classes running to at once. Then you've got head-to-head, which kind of felt like it was just a one-on-one thing that you could do in your normal race creator mode, to be honest. But there was also eliminations, drifting, which is always my least favourite event in all the things that Codemasters does. I'm not a fan of drifting, so I try to spend as least amount of time on that as possible. And point to point did make a return here as well, with long stretches of road, but there's only a few of those available, and so it's a little bit underutilised in the game itself. The other cool thing I thought was that you've got boost racing in this game as well, which is specific to electric vehicles on the whole, but you don't get that kind of Formula E boost lanes in R Factor 2, and that's got an official Formula E patch on. So you kind of go, you've managed to do it. I thought that was just very interesting. I'm also a big fan of the graphics of this game. Initially I thought it might be slightly washed out in terms of colour palette, and that was kind of confirmed for me when they added on retro game colour filters in the photo mode recently, because the 2000 games, really bright and beautiful in your face, very Dirt 5-ish. But I do like the graphical style here, and I think it's really accentuated with the light effects that take place. If you've got something at sunrise or sunset, or if you're going around some of the street circuits at night, they're perfectly done in your face, and really quite immersive, whereas the ones where you're out on circuits and tracks do feel venue-ish, if that makes sense, and much more realistic, which I always appreciate. I prefer my grid games to be slightly towards more realism than they are arcade, although this is very Arcadian in terms of its handling, which we'll get onto in a second. The visual feel of this game looks good. I was a big fan of LBRY back on PS3 era gaming, where it was like a Micro Machines game with modern, realistic graphics. I thought that game was superb in terms of its style. The same kind of thing applies here. I'd also want to shout out as well the weather system. So you've got wet, you've got sprinkly wet, you've got proper full-on thunderstorm, you've got fog, you've got snow and like slightly icy versus like very, very icy everywhere. And that times up with all of the different variants of tracks. Unlike games like Gran Turismo that have kind of only allowed you to have wet weather on a couple of tracks, it's available everywhere here, and it really does open up the replayability for the custom race builder, which I spend an awful lot of time in, making my own type of events up and causing chaos and carnage and just seeing different things that the game's able to do that it doesn't put to you on a plate. Next up is the handling, and my word for this is boxy. So it's very point and squirt, and it is Arcadian, but it has that kind of, I'm going to say F1 2017 approach, where all of a sudden, like, a slight overcorrection will send you spearing off in the other direction without warning, and it will send you into a tailspin. And it is very specific to curbs, but it's also specific to if you're going up, because there's quite a lot of gradient in this game. If you're doing like Mount Panorama, Bathurst, trying to get down like that back end of the circuit, your car will invariably be flying off somewhere. But there's quite a lot of other events like Okotama, for example, where you'll have the same problems. And you just need to kind of learn to feather off things much more than perhaps what the initial handling feels like it should. The only thing I would say is that by it being boxy and very point, turn, squirt out, it does lack finesse and precision, and so I don't always feel like doing the same thing twice always gets the same result. But the more hours you spend with it, the more you kind of get used to that nuance, and it feels more wrestly and Americanized, as if you're trying to hustle a car around a track rather than gently gliding something in. And what I would say is that whilst each car does feel different, instead of things feeling more finessed as you get to the more aerodynamic cars, they just feel more oversteery. And so they feel much more Arcadian as you get up to, like the Renault 2006 F1 car is ridiculous and almost undrivable because of it. So I do think it suffers slightly in the handling, which I think is one of the main things to judge a game by. But it's got that awkwardness of rough around the edges, ragged, drag it by the scruff of its neckness about it, which I think lends itself well to people who don't necessarily do driving games so often, being it's much easier to integrate them into this kind of racing game, I think, sometimes, and having a real nuance to it. One of the things that does have real nuance to it, though, albeit an inconsistent one, is the damage model. Haha! I really like some of the stuff that they do with the damage model here. And it's because you can spank yourself up against a wall and you can feel through the DualSense controller that something's not right, and you can like feel in the vibration there's a cog going loose somewhere, and then it might not like pop a tyre, but you can feel the deflation starting to take place inside the controller, and I thought that was fantastic. That the same thing applies to bodywork as well, so you'll start to see something rattle, and it won't be until it hits a few curbs and you can see it starting to rattle more, and I'm thinking, yep, this is progressive. And then you get to like proper high speed and then it will just flick off. And instead of it just being like an explosion of carbon fibre on your first initial impact, I really love this style of falling apart, delaminization, all of that stuff. It just feels really well integrated. The same applies to engine performance as well. That can take a tanking. Gearbox, you can start missing gears, all of that kind of stuff. And you can turn this on or off, but I thoroughly recommend having it on because it's far more fun to play, especially if you're trying to sim it up a bit with this game. One thing that is not simmy, and has definitely been stolen from Drive to Survive, is the story mode. But it is so camp and ridiculous, I genuinely enjoyed myself. The cast are, I think, really well done in the fact that they start off trying to be slightly serious, and by the end of it they've clearly given up and are just taking the mick and having a good laugh of it as well. And it's a feel-good story. It reminds me heavily of Toka Race Driver, which I thoroughly enjoy and still think is probably the best version of this type of game. But this is probably a close second because it's got lots of good characters, and yeah, just great fun. I do want to give a special shout out to Shuti Gatwa because he is, I swear that he's not reading a script and he's just going like off freeballing, and it's just hilarious because you can see the other people are like, what? And they've put outtakes, I think, into some of the stuff, particularly the DLC, because it's just people taking the piss. So yay, a thumbs up for me. This brings me to the next point, which I think has become really accentuated with F1 2022 out as a good side-by-side comparison. Grid Legends has a personality, and I wished other racing games would have more of a personality too. It's okay to take a stance on some things, and do you know what? We're going to have a camp story mode. Or do you know what? We're going to have an awful lot of neon vibes going on. This, we can't possibly have a personality because we might alienate some of our audience, is leading us to a really bland period in racing games, in my opinion. F1 22 is probably the epitome of that. That feels like it's been corporatized by design, or designed by corporate. And it's felt like it's lost its way to me, and a few other racing games have done the same thing for me, to be honest. So it's great to have something wearing a personality on its sleeve, and that might put some people off, and some people who think that they're really, really hard and like edgy on the internet will be like, ooh, cringe, blah, 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 blah. I don't care. It's giving me a proper experience, and I feel much more integrated into a game because of it. Give me more of that, please. Part of that comes from the Nemesis system. The Nemesis system is this real-time AI behaviour trait system that will decide if you keep hitting people, they get angry and start hitting back. Now, the Nemesis system is interesting because I love the idea of this. In actuality, though, it hinders the game slightly more than what it should do. Because with that beautiful damage model that I mentioned earlier, and cars will explode and they will spin off and they do their own mistakes, which is fantastic. The Nemesis system basically means that if you touch people a couple of times, they get angry and then start trying to pitch you into a dirty spin and go proper like Michael Schumacher, Ayrton Senna on you. Trying to tip you into a spin at the worst point. Or Lance Stroll, I guess, if you're in current mentality these days. But you find that because they go out of their way to try and hit you, it actually slows them down more, and so sometimes it plays into your advantage to have more nemesis than you do actual allies in the game itself, driving and racing properly, because they cause their own accidents. In the latest patch, in the final patch, they've kind of toned this down slightly and also stopped the longevity of how long someone stays a nemesis against you for, which I think is good because I was starting to rack up quite a reputation amongst the AI. Whoopsie. But it does add much needed personality to the AI, which otherwise are just names on a page to teams of certain colours. And I think that goes quite a long way actually to giving the wider world than just the characters you see in story mode existing. The other thing I think I want to mention that Grid Legends does very well is customization. This, I think, is just increasingly showing just how controlled and ridiculous the F1 Season Pass has become because of just the sheer amount of stuff that Grid Legends, and the same for Dirt 5 as well, has in its customization. Tons of options. Some liveries are blatant throwbacks to retro real motorsports liveries, but then you can palletise them. You can start doing your own kind of mini versions of them as well. They're all savable. And you can really dive into the background of all of this and spend an awful lot of time in customization. I didn't need to because I found that actually some of the default stuff was really well designed and looked good anyway. But if you love a good customization option, no, you can't build your own liveries from scratch, but there's so much here for you to kind of layer things on. This is a really good hybrid between the sheer clamp downness that, say, an F1 game has and the potentially overwhelming ability to do something entirely from scratch that Gran Turismo 7 has. This is a really good meaty middle ground. The next thing I want to talk about is multiplayer. Multiplayer has a really cool system of dropping in and out mid-race, and it allows you to take over from an AI competitor of someone that's racing something online. I found multiplayer to work really quite well and sync up quite nicely. I have to say I didn't spend too much time in it though, and what I didn't like about this is that it tries to put all of your games into an online mode unless you tell it otherwise. And I found that when I was going through the career mode of trying to unlock various different things and it was saying you must win this race, and all of a sudden I was being dragged into someone else's multiplayer race, that was annoying me, so I chose to start opting out of online modes much more often. But I appreciate the fact that you can there's no wait time, you just drop into someone else's race mid-race and take over from there. And I think that's a unsung but quite revolutionary thing to do in a motorsports game. So, we're talking complete editions, so let's look at the DLC packs to see exactly what they are all about, because they're quite a lot of money when you're looking at buying a season pass altogether, and I'm on the fence as to whether or not they were good or not. The first DLC pack was all around bringing in like a Destruction Derby style mode to the game, and I have to say this is probably the least exciting one of the four, which surprised me because I did like Dirt Showdown, but the problem is that it feels slightly unoptimized for the gaming experience that Dirt Legends provides. So the way how you have to hit your opponents, particularly when you're with an ice cream truck, which is immensely satisfying. The scoring system is really balked. Sometimes it will give you loads of points, sometimes it will give you nothing. Sometimes you'll hit an enemy and it will damage them way more than it damages you. Other times it will be the other way round, or you'll get both. I did find that sometimes actually the AI get heavily stuck and they're not able to complete races either. And I also found that on a couple of the tracks there were some really odd collision issues with curbs which still exist now that the game is finished. So I feel like this is the roughest around the edge pack that's out there of the four, and probably the one that I've least enjoyed. The next one was all around endurance racing. This added in the Fuji circuit as well, which I thought was a great addition. Endurance racing is good fun. I don't like the fact that everyone's position is decided when the leader crosses the line though, but I do appreciate that endurance racing is now in the game, looking good. Now obviously this game doesn't have like full-on pit stops throughout the game, so endurance racing is just do a long race, but it is nice to have things there and you can do multi-class and all of that kind of stuff, and you could potentially do some of this with some of the custom race builder stuff that you were doing, but it's nice to have it as its own distinct mode with its own kind of car collection that comes along with it as well, which is quite good fun. The third DLC I think is probably the most cinematic and fun one, even if the endurance racing added on an actual mode. The Raven West DLC pack adds in loads and loads of story interview segments with the Toka race driver Ryan McCain versus what your current McCains are now, and it ties together the legacy of the Grid games in a really nice way. And something in me kind of made me think, is this them trying to do a swan song to the Grid series because it's not going to come back for a while? I don't know how well Grid Legends did, but it does kind of make me go, this feels quite fitting for a goodbye for now. And that kind of made me quite sad, because they were sending it up in a weird comedic way. But what it did do was go back in time to cars that used to be in the Grid series, but also filters that were in the Grid series. And yeah, it just felt like instantly nostalgic. Someone that's been sim racing and racing games for decades. It was just a really good, fun, bite-sized piece. And it also added in a decent Miami circuit as well, not the F1 circuit, a street one. The fourth one, I think, was a bit of a damp squib for me personally because it focuses more on drifting. And this kind of winter pack is all around drift events, adds in 3 cars, no new tracks. But what it does do is provide like drifting layouts on other tracks and adds in ramp versions because it's all around like street party stuff. So bouncing up and down on ramps, putting boost pads everywhere, and just fixing things that were broken over time, because there are quite a few bugs in Grid Legends, and I think that's what I'd like to kind of round off my review on. Because the season pass for me, I think, is get it on sale. I think this whole game to me is actually, I'm glad that I got it on sale, and I think that's maybe swaying a lot of my judgment on this, because for the sheer price point that I bought it at versus the hours of gameplay I've had in this game, I have definitely had my money's worth, and I will continue to play this game beyond completion. But it comes with a few bug warnings. The first one really angered me, and it seems to have been fixed in part, but it still crops up for me and I have to exit and go back into the game, and that is career progression resets. This game, if you change the difficulty, and sometimes the difficulty was getting changed for you if you joined an online multiplayer session, it would wipe my career progress. And I'd got nearly to the very end of career, and it has now completely balked my career progress, so I had to restart from scratch. It then got fixed in the DLC 3 patch, but it's slightly broken career progression, because some cars are unlocked when they shouldn't be, some cars are locked when they should be unlocked, and sponsors that unlock certain vehicles when you complete them through various different challenges in the career mode seem to now be missing, and I can't seem to trigger what happened before to get them to go again. But I'm so close to finishing the career mode that I'm just like, do you know what, sod it. But it's now locked me out the platinum trophy. I don't want to wipe all of my progress and start again, because there's like well over 50-60 hours into this game by now, and I've had to kind of do this a couple of times over, and I'm so over that it's really left a bitter bad taste in my mouth. Whilst that's been the main bug for me, I have had a few other things where, like flashing of images, getting stuck in menus, that kind of stuff, and it crops up often enough for it to be a noticeable feature, but it has got better as each patch has kind of come out since. But there are still things that are broken that I wished would be fixed, particularly in the menus, where things sometimes just get inaccessible and you have to keep closing and restarting. I find that slightly odd. But overarchingly, I would say Grid Legends has increasingly become a breath of fresh air for me. I love its personality and its little nuances. The fact that there is running commentary going when you start a race, and then the woman's like, oh, sorry, I'll shut up now, it's time for the race to begin, when you dive into a race early. It's all the little things in the background that show that there's an awful lot of an attentive love and care that feels like it's gone into this game. And whilst it's probably missing its last 15% of a handling model to make it feel like it's accessible to all and really precise and engaging, it's like a rough around the edges diamond that you kind of grow fond of over time and enjoy its intricacies and weirdness and little quirks and oddities. And whilst I dearly love my career progression to sort itself out, I think if you're coming in now fresh from the ground up, you should be safe and okay. And it's been a bit more of a problem for legacy players. So yeah, I appreciate that was a massive long review, probably the most longest one that I've done yet, but there's just so much to say about this game because there's so much in it. Any questions or comments that you have, please drop them down below and I'll answer them as I get to them. Take care. Higher Plane Games is part of the Higher Plane Network, a completely independent media outlet supported by people like you. The goal is to create the best possible content that cultivates a richer indie scene for games as well as music and entertainment. To find out more and to get involved, visit patreon.com/higherplane-network. Your support makes all the difference, and in return you'll gain access to bonus content and downloads. Thank you for watching.